This is Kick-Ass Politics. I'm Ben Mathis. Hi, folks. Just a quick announcement. We're in the midst of a very important fundraising drive to come up with all of our production costs for 2016. So if you like Kick-Ass Politics and you value what I'm doing here, then I hope you'll go to gofundme.com/kickasspolitics and donate what you can. It's vital that we fund our production budget for the coming year so I can focus my energies on the content side of Kick-Ass Politics, which is probably a lot more involved than you might think. So be a part of what I'm creating here. Just go to gofundme.com/kickasspolitics or hit the donate button on our webpage at kickasspolitics.com. If you go there now and donate something, anything, doesn't matter what amount, I promise I'll keep doing what I'm doing here and producing new shows for you every week. Thanks in advance, folks. And now, enjoy the show.
Prison is a place that is a repository of human misery. There are lots of people who have been incarcerated for 10, 15, 20 years who have not seen their children for a decade or longer, have not spoken to another person on the outside because they haven't had a visit or haven't even had anyone to call for years. The hardest part, I think for me at first, is just trying to make sure that you can stay safe. You know, I went into prison at about 5'6", 117 pounds. The guys there were a whole nother level size-wise and probably in terms of toughness too. If you get on the wrong side of the prison administration, you can find yourself doing your entire bid in solitary, and that can drive you crazy. There is so much misery that you really have to work to try to make sure that you don't fall prey to the same despair that pervades the institution.
That was Jeff Smith describing the bleakness of prison life. His is not the typical inmate story. He was a college professor and a state senator who became a rising political star in Missouri when he almost defeated Russ Carnahan to take over the congressional seat vacated by Dick Gephardt in 2004. But in 2009, everything came crashing down for Jeff Smith when he lied in an affidavit to the Federal Election Commission about a relatively minor campaign finance violation. This was Jeff's first and only run-in with the law. He had been a model citizen, giving back to his community and even founding a successful charter school. But in spite of that, he was sentenced to a year in the federal correction facility in Manchester, Kentucky. His year in prison opened his eyes to the many areas where the U.S. criminal justice system is failing inmates, families, taxpayers, law enforcement, and society in general. While the U.S. represents 5% of the world's population, America houses 25% of the world's prisoners. 1 in every 100 Americans is currently behind bars. Now, you might think that that's a good thing. After all, everyone wants our streets to be safer, and we're all for putting bad guys away. But consider this. U.S. taxpayers spend $50 billion a year to house and feed federal prisoners, 90% of whom are nonviolent offenders. Add to that another $25 billion spent to house state prisoners, half of whom are also nonviolent offenders. For all that money spent, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, over half of all prisoners released are rearrested within just 1 year, and within 5 years of release, that number jumps up to 75%, all of which makes the so-called corrections system something of an oxymoron. And with 1 in every 28 children growing up with a parent behind bars, it's clear that there are much larger costs to society to be considered. Today, I'm going to look at where America's prison system is failing us, and some ways to spend less and achieve better outcomes. You'll hear more from Jeff Smith, who is now out of prison, and he's written a revealing new book called Mr. Smith Goes to Prison, What My Year Behind Bars Taught Me About America's Prison Crisis. After that, Julie Stewart, the president of Families Against Mandatory Minimums, will tell me why we need to hand federal sentencing discretion back to the judges on the bench. And finally, I'll talk with Senator Rob Portman, who's been a leader in championing innovative legislation focused on not just punishing criminals, but actually rehabilitating them and making them productive members of society once more. Coming up in just a moment.
Hollywood to Washington, it's time for Kick-Ass Politics. And now here's your host, Ben Mathis.
I'm talking with Jeff Smith, who you heard from the intro to this podcast. Jeff, you spent a year in federal prison for a federal election violation. What was that first day like arriving in Manchester?
Well, I remember going to the intake, and a middle-aged woman, we're in deep Southeast Kentucky, so Appalachia, and she says, education level? PhD. And she raised her eyebrows. She says, last profession? State senator. And she said, well, if you want to play games, you can play games. We got ones here think they're Jesus Christ, so you'll fit right in.
Well, like you mentioned, you had a PhD, and you had spent about 10 years teaching. All the prisoners got assigned a job, and you thought that you might be able to put your experience to good use and make the best of your time and help teach a GED course or a literacy class. But instead, you got assigned to backbreaking work in the prison warehouse. What did this tell you about where the correction system prioritizes education and actual rehabilitation?
Well, there was no discernible attempt at rehabilitation that I saw during my time there. There were 3 courses offered during the time that I was incarcerated. The first was a course on hydroponics, about 2-week course on how to grow tomatoes in water. Because what could better prepare you for a successful reentry after, right?
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. Then there was like a couple-week-long GED course, which was basically a farce. Taught by another prisoner, and the prison evinced no interest in whether or not anyone attended that course. And finally, there was a computer skills course, which occurred about a month before I left. It was a pre-release course that they required everyone going home to take. They made us sign in when we got into the room. There were 12 brand new computers that had been laying there unused the entire year. And we all sat down. After signing in, they told us, the CO in charge, he said, hey, you see a little button on the bottom right? Push that button in. That'll turn your computer on. So we all push that button. Sit there. About 2 minutes later, the CO is looking at a prisoner, and a prisoner tries to move the mouse. And he says, hey, CO, if I move this thing, and the CO says, shut the fuck up.
God.
We sat there for another 40 minutes or so, until the CO said to everyone, all right, you remember that little button on the bottom right? You push it again, and then get back to your cell.
So that was the power switch, huh?
That was the power
They taught you how to
switch,
turn it on and off.
That's what we learned.
Wow.
And, but we did sign in, which meant that the prison could then send that sheet as corroboration to the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and then get a stipend for every prisoner who had completed this course.
Well, I just want to know, are they PC or are they Mac people in prison?
PC.
Ah, okay, that figures. All right. Well, in another attempt to make the most of your time, you wrote a book while you were serving your sentence at Manchester, and it's recently been published. It's called Mr. Smith Goes to Prison: What My Year Behind Bars Taught Me About America's Prison Crisis. Apparently, according to your book, there is a whole booming prison economy that's going on just under the surface, which probably comes as no surprise to anyone. What are some examples of the kind of enterprise and ingenuity that you saw amongst your fellow prisoners?
Well, I saw unbelievable ingenuity. There's not a single concept that you would learn at Wharton that you could not learn inside federal prison. I saw guys run all sorts of businesses, everything from perfectly legal businesses, like guys who were very artistic and they would draw portraits of other prisoners' mothers or daughters that could be sent home for birthdays, to somewhat less legal businesses, like guys who cooked with stolen food from the warehouse, to even less legal businesses like running a tattoo parlor out of your cell, to the most illegal businesses like smuggling in steroids or drugs. I read 15 business plans while I was in there and gave feedback on them from guys who had big dreams for what they wanted to do when they got out. The sad thing, as we talked about a minute ago, though, is that there was absolutely no training in helping these guys translate their intuitive grasp of these business concepts into any legitimate enterprises when they got out.
It's almost become a cliche these days to say that people go to prison and they end up learning how to become better criminals. We hear that time and time again. But you saw firsthand how the system really, to a certain degree, forces a guy like you, who, but for one mistake, always kind of walked the straight and narrow, to bend or break the rules, skirt authority. And it seems to me that this is the opposite of what we want to do. It's, if anything, it's breeding the wrong kind of mentality when prisoners re-enter society.
Well, that's exactly right. Prisons, because so many prisoners are destitute, don't have a penny to their name, but they have to pay for everything themselves. So if you want soap, if you want deodorant, if you want a toothbrush or toothpaste, you got to find a way to pay for it. And you're going to pay 40 to 50% marked up prices over what you'd pay on the street.
Wow.
And that's why prisoners are hustling, right? That's why they're starting their own little businesses here or there, is to try to just make enough money to survive and to make enough money for a phone call home every few weeks. So our society and our prison system is reinforcing our prisoners' tendencies to operate outside the mainstream economy, and that's not helpful. And there's another way that it's really unhelpful, which is that it's causing people to be so poor inside of prison that they can't afford to stay in touch with loved ones, right? Prison phone calls while I was there cost almost $2 per minute.
Yeah, that shocked me.
Yeah, it's ridiculous, and most guys couldn't afford it.
And one other thing that you mentioned is that a lot of prisons are talking about cutting out visiting hours, in-person visits from friends and family, and going to some kind of a video chat system, which would just be another way to fleece these prisoners.
That's right. They're doing that. And the video chats are not regulated thus far by the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, which have started to regulate the prices that are allowed for prison phone calls. And so, of course, these companies, realizing that their pot of gold, their little profit center is coming to an end with FCC regulation of phone calls, have moved to this other video visits. And it's a shame, but the reason for it is that they promise, when they enter into contracts with prisons, they promise that a certain percentage of their proceeds will go back to the prison administration. And so the prison administration has a perverse incentive to actually enter into contracts with companies that will charge the most as long as they're getting a cut out of it. It's a sickening thing to watch these companies and the prison system make money and basically gouge some of the most vulnerable people and families in society.
Yeah, that's an astounding conflict of interests. And speaking of the families, you have so many children that are growing up without a father figure and just breeding more young people who will eventually end up going to prison because they haven't had any kind of family structure, any father figure. Did you see some of that when you were in prison?
Sure.
Did you see some of these families start to fall apart?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's nothing more heartbreaking than watching a father scrape up a few dollars to make a phone call to his kid, and then have the mother of his child hang up the phone on him or talk to him for a minute and give him a hassle for a minute, and then his 1 or 2 minutes runs out, and he's going to have to wait another month to make enough money to have another 2-minute phone call, and he slams down the phone. Such frustration. And that was matched only by how heartbreaking it was to watch 3, 4, 5-year-old children peeled off their fathers at the end of visiting hours, not understanding why their father had to leave.
God.
One of the things that they're also doing that's so destructive to prisoners reentering is they're looking the other way when it comes to sexual violence inside of prisons.
Mm.
There's almost 300,000 rapes that take place every year inside of our prisons, more than the number that take place in America outside of prisons.
Wow.
And very sadly, a disproportionate number of the men who have been raped inside of prison will leave prison and in a sad, tragic way, attempt to reclaim the manhood that they perceive was stolen from them by committing sexual assault when they get out.
Oh,
and
God.
the fact that we tolerate rape culture in prison, because a lot of prison guards and really society in general has the attitude of, oh, if you're in prison, you probably deserve whatever you get. That type of attitude has profoundly negative consequences for public safety on the outside.
Well, at the end of the book, even once you got released, you had to do 2.5 months in a halfway house. But you talk about a very interesting contrast between the mentality and the goals of a halfway house versus your experience in federal prison.
The halfway house director, he just took me on my first or second day and said, look, we want to get you out of here as fast as possible. We know it doesn't make any sense that you're here because you have a house that you still own and you don't need to be here. Why should we waste a bed that we could get someone out of prison 6 months earlier than they would have otherwise come out? And they don't have a place to stay, but we could get them close to their family and back in the community. We'd rather do that than waste a bed on you. So we're going to get you out of here as fast as you can because you already have, I had a part-time job that I'd already lined up. So anyway, they had a much more kind of pragmatic view of reentry than the prison did.
Well, what are some other solutions that you came up with from your personal experience in prison?
A broader reform to the system that I think could be effective would be to change the way that we pay our correctional officers. In their eyes, at least, they had an incentive in making sure that prisoners failed when they got out so that they would return back into the system. They viewed them as job security. What if we changed things and we tracked everyone coming out of prison at 6-month intervals, and every 6 months that they were flying straight and didn't reoffend, we paid a bonus to the correctional officers who had guarded them in their unit, a $250, a $500 bonus. So by the end of 2 or 3 years of flying straight, the CO who guarded you, as long as you keep your nose clean, might end up with $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 extra. So instead of the incentive being to tear you down and dehumanize you, their incentive would be to build you up and help equip you to succeed in society. What about that?
Think about that, folks. We reward teachers and schools who produce students with the best test scores. Why not reward prisons that succeed in actually reforming prisoners and turning them into productive members of society again? But another problem in the system is that many of Jeff's fellow inmates at Manchester Prison were relatively low-level, non-violent drug offenders who really didn't belong in federal prison or were serving much longer sentences than their crime warranted, thanks to federal mandatory minimum sentencing requirements signed into law over 30 years ago. So I talked with Julie Stewart, president of a group called Families Against Mandatory Minimums, about some of the unintended consequences of letting politicians, rather than judges, determine prison sentences. Julie, thanks for taking the time to talk to me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm happy to be here.
You took up the cause of mandatory sentencing reform when this issue hit very close to home for you and your family. Talk about the event that led you to form FAM.
Yes. My brother was growing marijuana in Washington State in a garage, unbeknownst to me. And I was working at the Cato Institute when I got a call from him. And he said that he was in jail in Spokane, Washington. And I was like, what are you talking about? And he said, well, I was arrested for growing marijuana. And my first thought, this was really 25 years ago, my first thought was, how stupid of you to be growing marijuana. But my second thought was, well, it's only marijuana, so, I guess he won't get punished too much. But then I began to understand what was happening, and as did he. And he was prosecuted federally, which is in itself bizarre. He was growing marijuana in a garage Washington State. It wasn't like he crossed state lines. There was no particular federal nexus for the federal government to pick up some pot growers. But the federal government in the late 80s and 90s was picking up a lot of small drug cases and prosecuting them and getting really long sentences. So what I learned was that my brother was facing a minimum of 5 years in prison without parole in federal prison. He would have faced more if he had chosen to go to trial, which of course would have been absurd because he was guilty. The only way he could have gotten out from under that 5-year sentence was if he informed on someone else. But he said that he would not have been able to live with himself by ruining someone else's life. So he chose not to inform on anyone and ended up doing 5 years in federal prison. But it was his experience that opened my eyes to these laws that prohibit the judge from giving the sentence that he or she thinks is appropriate. And in my brother's case, he wanted to give Jeff 2 years in prison. And he said at sentencing to the 25-year-old assistant U.S. attorney who was prosecuting Jeff, he said, you are fresh out of law school, and you're telling me, a federal judge who's been on the bench for 25 years, what the sentence is that I have to give this man. So that was such an eye-opener for me. I'm not a lawyer. I have had your basic, civics 101, like most people, and assumed that the judge got to determine the sentence. And that's just not true in cases that carry a mandatory prison sentence that has already been decided by members of Congress or state legislators who have never laid eyes on the defendant.
What else do you hear from the judges who have their hands tied and are forced to hand down these lengthy prison sentences?
You can imagine. I mean, judges, federal judges in particular, go through quite a screening process to get to the bench. They are nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and then you put them there and you say, okay, you can, we trust you to adjudicate these really complicated white-collar crimes or, other terrorism or other things, but we don't trust you in these cases that carry mandatory sentences, which are primarily drug crimes. So it's like Congress has selectively said, we don't trust you in these cases. And that's absurd.
When mandatory minimums were enacted 30 years ago, what kind of criminals were they designed to target?
30 years ago, Len Bias, the basketball star who was drafted from the University of Maryland to the Celtics, went out to celebrate and overdosed on powder cocaine. And when he died, it was really in Congress's backyard. And so members of Congress were just shocked by that. And it was 1986, and crack cocaine was a new drug on the scene. And every night on the TV, there was talk about crack babies and try crack cocaine once and you're addicted for life. And I mean, there was a lot of uncertainty and unfamiliarity and, the unknown of crack cocaine. So all of that combined with the fact that it was an election year drove members of Congress to say, we will fix this scourge of drugs that's, ravaging our countryside by passing these stiff mandatory sentencing laws. And even if you can agree with that principle, the way they did it is so absurd. There was not one hearing. There was no analysis done on what this was going to do to the prison population. Certainly no racial impact analysis done. Instead, it was done on the floor of the House as if it was a poker game. So one member of Congress would kind of say, well, for 100 marijuana plants, let's make it a 2-year sentence. And the next one would stand up and say, no, 3. And the next would say, no, 5. And it was just like picking numbers out of the air. As a result of this, our prison population has skyrocketed about 880% since 1986.
Yeah, it sounds like it was the result of politicians climbing all over each other, trying to seem tougher on crime than the next guy.
Yes, that's right. And I mean, mandatory sentencing laws are not new. We've had them on the books since 1790s when piracy would trigger a sentence of life without parole. And if you look at the 195 statutes that are on the books, it's really interesting. It reads like the crime du jour. You can see what the country was concerned about. Mm-hmm. In the 1800s, you got 6 months in prison for refusing to allow the government to put a telegram wire on your property. Or if you were dumping refuse in the Baltimore or New York harbors, you got 5 years in prison. All the way up through the assassination of JFK. After that, Congress passed a law that said, you go to prison for life without parole if you assassinate a cabinet member or the president. It's like, okay, gosh, I doubt a member, maybe a judge wouldn't have sentenced somebody to a long prison sentence for assassinating the president, but I think so. Yeah. So it's really interesting. You just see what Congress has done for over 200 years, which is to say, oh, this is what the public's concerned about, therefore we need to take some action. The action we're going to take is passing these stiff sentencing laws, even though we know, because if they wanted to look back at history that they don't have any deterrent effect, they still do it. And as a result, we end up with lots and lots and lots of people in prison serving very long sentences and costing taxpayers billions of dollars.
Your organization has pointed out that most of the people who are being hit by these mandatory minimums are not drug kingpins. You know, we're not talking about Pablo Escobar here. And on your website at fam.org, you have a number of pretty compelling stories of prisoners who've gotten caught in the system. Would you share one of those with us and maybe help put a face to this issue?
Yeah, I'll actually share one that's not on there. It's an older one, but it's always struck me as kind of perfectly telling what's wrong with these sentencing laws. The woman's name was Nicole Richardson, and she was 21 years old, dating a boyfriend who was 23 years old or something. And he was selling LSD, small amounts of LSD, and he owed money to somebody who was arrested and picked up by the government. So then that person became a confidential informant. So he called the guy's house to say, you know, I'm going to bring you the money that I owe you for buying LSD from you. And the girlfriend, Nicole Richardson, answered the phone. And she told the guy where to find her boyfriend to pay him back. That one phone call linked her into the conspiracy to distribute LSD when they arrested her boyfriend.
Oh, wow.
And she ended up getting 10 years in federal prison.
Wow.
Without parole. Her boyfriend, who actually had information to trade for a reduced sentence, ended up getting 5 years. And then to top this off, while she was in prison, she was talking to her mother on the phone, and somebody was breaking into her mother's apartment to try to rape her. And so Nicole was able to tell the authorities at the prison, please get somebody to my mom's apartment, blah, blah. They caught the guy. He was prosecuted, and he got 15 years in prison with parole for attempted rape.
Jeez.
I mean, something is really, really wrong with our system when we put people in prison, nonviolent people in prison for longer than, or as long, and many times longer than violent offenders.
That really is appalling, Julie. Well, we're going to take a quick break, and then I'll talk more with Julie Stewart, and Senator Rob Portman will discuss some new solutions that are helping to put criminals on the right path after prison. Back in just a moment. Earlier in the episode, you heard from Jeff Smith, author of Mr. Smith Goes to Prison, What My Year Behind Bars Taught Me About America's Prison Crisis. And right now, you can download the audio version of his book for free, with a special promotion for our listeners from audible.com. Just go to audibletrial.com/kickasspolitics for a free 30-day trial and a free audiobook download, which can be Mr. Smith Goes to Prison by my guest today, Jeff Smith, or any of Audible's 180,000 titles for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, iPad, or MP3 player. That's audibletrial.com/kickasspolitics. Or click on the sponsor link on our webpage to download the free audiobook of your choice. And now, back to the show. We're back, and I'm talking with Julie Stewart, president of Families Against Mandatory Minimums. So, Julie, when I look at your site at fam.org, you certainly have a lot of very convincing statistics to support the case against mandatory minimums. But one statistic that people probably give you all the time, and it must frustrate you, perhaps, is the fact that from 1984, when mandatory minimums were enacted, to 2014, crime in the U.S. has dropped by about, from what I see here, about 2.4 million, and violent crimes by about 75,000. What is the argument that you make to people who say, well, just look at the numbers. It's working. It worked.
Well, that's the super simplistic way to view those numbers. And of course, a lot of people, including legislators, like to look at it like that. But the fact of the matter is, if they just scratched the surface, they would see that in states like New York, for instance, that had the Rockefeller drug laws, which were a very stiff 15-year sentence for small amounts of cocaine or heroin, that state, the crime was going down before they repealed mandatory minimums, the Rockefeller drug laws, and it continued to go down dramatically after the repeal of Rockefeller drug laws. And this has been true in states across the country because the states have borne the brunt of these really long sentences that they all too eagerly adopted when Congress was offering them money in the 80s to do so. But then they got stuck with these huge prison populations and they couldn't afford them. So they've started, reducing sentencing laws, finding ways to get people out earlier. And basically, none of those reforms have led to increased crime rates in their states. All of them have continued to see crime drop. So the relationship between crime and sentencing is negligible. And, even the most generous estimate, I guess, of how much incarceration reduces crime is somewhere around 30%, 35%. But that even says, even if you can accept that number, that means that 70% or 75% of the reduction in crime has nothing to do with incarceration.
Yeah, because you're not against incarcerating rapists and murderers and violent offenders.
No, I'm not. Of
right.
course not.
I mean, there is a distinction there.
Yeah, and when you take a violent offender off the street, that person is not so likely to be replaced.
Yeah.
You take somebody selling cocaine off the street, the fact of the matter is there's going to be somebody taking his place pretty quickly. Which is not to say that they shouldn't be prosecuted. Even in my brother's case, he broke the law. You may not like the law. People want to change the law, but he broke the law. So I get it that there should be a punishment. And I hear this from parents all the time in the last 2 decades. My son, my daughter, they needed to be arrested. They needed even to be convicted and get away from their crowd for a year or maybe 2 years. But the length of the sentences that we are handing out basically, creates this population that no longer even knows how to live in this technologically sophisticated world that we are in today, when they've been in prison for 15 or 20 years or 30 years. Yeah. When they come out, it's like they're in a foreign country.
Yeah. And, there is kind of this sledgehammer approach to the issue, but I have to think that there are other creative ways that we can punish people.
No, that's right. And I think that we, especially the United States of America, we are such a nation of innovators. And we are punishing people in the same way that they were punished, 2,000 years ago, basically. So why is that? And I would even argue that Silicon Valley, with all of its great entrepreneurs who are thinking of ways to monitor everything, there should be an ankle bracelet type monitoring system that would allow someone to easily track where a person is, a nonviolent person. I'm not talking about putting violent people on the street, but, that allows them to go to their job, come back, be a parent, continue to earn money, to pay taxes, so that they're not the burden that they are today on our system, on our society, and are instead contributing to it. And of course, some people need drug treatment. I just don't think that that's an impossibility, and we really need to think more creatively.
Well, yeah, and when you have half of these cases, or over half of these cases being drug cases, the drug rehab programs within prisons are woefully inadequate to actually address the problem that they're supposed to be solving here.
Yes, that's correct. And in the federal system, you're not even allowed to take the drug treatment program until the last 18 months of your sentence, last year and a half. So if you've got a 10 or a 20-year sentence, you have to sit there for all of those years minus, the last year and a half where you get treatment. That makes absolutely no sense.
Yeah.
It's just, I've been to many prisons, and when you sit in the visiting room and look around and you think, I'm not scared of any of these people, and they're literally just like biding their time. A friend of mine got out of prison last spring, and he said he felt like he was a can on a shelf at a grocery store just waiting for his expiration date.
Wow. It's difficult because you're dealing with these much broader ideas of what does this do to a family? What does this do to a kid who grows up without a mother or father or both? What does it do to a family where they lose one of their wage earners?
Well, everything you've just said is absolutely right. Families are often devastated by the incarceration of their loved one. There's a young man named Paul Fields who's in prison for 15 years for growing about 30 plants worth of marijuana, and he had prior offenses possessing LSD and possessing, I think maybe methamphetamine, I can't remember, but small amounts, not even distribution, just possession. And so it was his third strike, so to speak. So he is in prison, sitting there for 15 years while his wife, who had just given birth to their 6-month-old daughter, is trying to, support her, take her to see her dad so that they can still have a relationship. She moved in with his parents who are in their 80s and are elderly and really need their, strapping 35-year-old son home with them so that they can, have his support. Maybe he's 45 years old. But, it's just, what is the point of all that? Nobody wins here.
Yeah.
The daughter only knows her dad from prison. The wife, is trying to provide enough money to support the two of them and probably a little bit the older couple, his parents that they're living with. The parents need their son there just to literally help them, physically help them. Nobody is benefiting by his incarceration.
Wow. Yeah, and it's very hard to parent, I imagine, off of just a visit once a week or once a month.
Yeah.
What are some of the biggest success stories that you can point to at the state level?
Delaware repealed most of its mandatory minimums. In Pennsylvania, the state Supreme Court actually just ruled all of their mandatory minimums are unconstitutional.
Huh.
Texas has been really forward-thinking in getting rid of certain sentencing laws, tweaking other ones to allow prisoners to get out earlier, finding treatment instead of incarceration. So, states have just made lots of tweaks to the system to make sure that their prison populations are no longer costing the taxpayers so much and that they're, letting people out who are not scary.
And much of your time and effort is spent lobbying for sentencing reform in Congress. Now, in this soundbite culture, no politician wants to lose an election because he or she looked like they were soft on crime. So how do you make this argument to them?
It's really interesting when you look at the votes in the Senate last year on the Smarter Sentencing Act, which is one of the reform bills that is in the Congress. The vote almost split exactly down age. And I think that the new generation of Republicans and possibly Democrats too, but are looking at this as, let's be smarter. Are there alternatives? Is there a more cost-effective way of dealing with people who break the law? And so I think there's just a more general openness to reform among a younger generation.
Yeah, and it seems like this is really the moment for sentencing reform because I'm hearing a lot more than I ever did. I'm hearing Jeb Bush talking about it. I'm hearing Rand Paul, Ted Cruz. A lot of the big players in the 2016 election are starting to seriously highlight this issue.
Yeah, that's right. Ted Cruz and Rand Paul are both co-sponsors of some of the great sentencing bills that are in the Senate. So I think there's just been a shift all the way across the board. We just had a poll done last month, and 77% of the public support the repeal of mandatory minimums, and 71% of conservatives support the repeal of mandatory minimums. I'm talking about nonviolent offenders. But
yeah,
that's fantastic. That's like a huge move from 5 years ago when we did a poll. So I think that there's just this acceptance that it's not going to make you lose your election. The Willie Horton shadow, which was big and dark for many years over any member of Congress who dared to say they wanted to reduce prison populations, I think that has mostly disappeared.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned the Willie Horton ad because throughout this conversation, I keep having this image in my head of the old attack ad that they ran against Michael Dukakis with the revolving door at the prison. And to me, it seems like the revolving door is almost going in the reverse now, where instead of, criminals just hitting the streets all the time, we're putting people away for so long that they're losing all their opportunities in life. They end up just going straight back to prison after a year or two.
If you think about it, any other big organization that produced the failure rate that prisons do, it would have been shut down long ago. Instead, we put people in prison, we let them sit there for however long, we're going to make them stay. We don't really do much to address their underlying problems. We don't do a lot of job training, and they really don't have a lot of options. So it isn't easy to stay on the straight and narrow. I cannot imagine anything that would be more expensive and less effective than putting people in prison for 10 or 15 or 20 years or life.
Yeah.
And even if it's not life and they're going to get out again, it's just such a short-term view because they're not going to get out better people. They're not going to get out more prepared to, be law-abiding, contributing members of society.
What, or perhaps I should say who, are the biggest impediments to sentencing reform?
There really isn't any. And there isn't any organized opposition. It's almost that it's just been the status quo for so long that people can't think about it another way.
Wow.
And that's why I say, again, this younger, fresher crop of legislators that are coming into Congress are generally helpful because they come in without the history and the sort of imprint of lock them up and throw away the key.
One of the people she's talking about is Senator Rob Portman of Ohio. Here's how he got involved with the issue of criminal justice reform.
Well, Ben, when I was first elected to the House back in 1993, I started getting involved in the anti-drug issue. I had a constituent who lost his son to an overdose. At that time, my focus was more on the substance abuse issue and how to focus on prevention and education and avoiding people getting into the cycle or the funnel of addiction. And so I actually started to learn more and more through that about the fact that most people who were being arrested were, either high on drugs or were under the influence of alcohol, and that there was such a strong connection to substance abuse and those who were behind bars. And in fact, at that time, as you know, we were locking up a lot more people for possession. And so I started to learn more about our prison population, and I began to think about how if we could help them with their drug problems, it would be good to get people out of prison and get them, back into productive lives. And then that led to a broader look at this whole issue of how do you get people the job skills they need, mental health treatment in addition to drug treatment. And I just learned that there are some great programs going around the country that have been very successful in getting people out of prison and into that transition into their communities and back to their families. And the alternative is unfortunately what is often happening, which is you give somebody, $5 to clothes on their back and a bus pass, and they're back in prison within a few years. Unfortunately, that's where more than 50% of these people end up, is back in the system again.
Well, you're a Republican, and for a long time, criminal justice reform has been a third rail among conservatives, many of whom are just now starting to come around on this issue. If you're talking to one of your Republican constituents or a Tea Party in your home state of Ohio, what is the case to be made for criminal justice reform as a conservative issue?
Well, I think it's absolutely a conservative issue. And, 10 years ago when I authored what's called the Second Chance Act, I had a lot of these discussions. I represented the 2nd District of Ohio, a very conservative district, and I represent the whole state of Ohio. But I did have constituents who challenged me on it and said, why are you helping people getting out of prison? Why should we care? And we should care for a number of reasons. One of which is a very conservative one, which is it costs about $30,000 a year to house an inmate. So, yeah. Every taxpayer should be concerned and think of the money that we have wasted as people go through this revolving door, being arrested and rearrested, 5-6 times, as I found out with some of these guys and some women who I've talked to and had a chance to get to know over the years through this project that we've been working on. And then second, it is conservative not to have these people back out there committing crimes. Half these people or more are recommitting crimes and getting back into the system. And that's certainly something that all of us care about. And then finally, as a conservative and as someone who is a Christian, I do believe in second chances. And I think that notion of redemption, and I think that's consistent with a lot of us who are not just fiscal conservatives, but social conservatives, to think that, we do believe that God has a plan for all of us. And if there's a way to get people the tools they need to be able to turn their lives around, they're going to save the taxpayer money, they're going to reduce crime, and they're also going to be able to reach their God-given potential and get their families back together. So I think it's one where conservatives are more and more interested and even excited about. And I'm one of those conservatives. I believe it makes a lot of sense, and I'm going to continue to do all I can to promote it.
As the former director of the Office of Management and Budget under President George W. Bush, I can definitely see how this issue would make sense to you from a fiscal standpoint and an accountability standpoint.
That's true, Ben. And, I was a fiscal hawk in that job. I actually proposed a balanced budget over 5 years, not 10 years. We do need to get back on a sound fiscal footing, and one way to do it is to reduce these costs. a lot of the cost is borne by the states. So sometimes at the federal level, members of Congress don't focus on this as much as I think they should. If you ask the states, and Ohio is certainly one, what are your highest costs? They will say Medicaid and prisons. Mm-hmm. And those are not just consuming most of the budget now, but it's the highest increase year to year.
So we were talking about the Second Chance Act that you authored in 2008, back when you were in Congress, which sought to support state and local prisoner reentry programs and reduce prison recidivism rates. Now, one thing that I liked about this, and again, this is kind of going back to that fiscal accountability issue, is that a small portion of the budget on that was spent to measure the efficacy of the program over the past 6 years. What have we learned from that data?
In Ohio, thanks to the Second Chance Act being used aggressively and some other work being done at the state level on prisoner reentry, we've actually reduced our recidivism rates in Ohio. We've reduced them by about 11 or 12%.
Wow.
Just in the last few years.
That's great. And explain exactly how the Second Chance Act works.
Then the Second Chance Act is legislation at the federal level that provides for grants back to states. These are matching grants, so you have to have funding at the local level. You have to have buy-in at the local level. We require that the community be engaged. So you have law enforcement, you need social services, you need to have educators, everybody working together. In Ohio, for instance, we've taken advantage of this legislation, and initially we just had about 2 or 3 counties that had reentry task forces. Now you have 70 counties out of 88 that have a reentry task force, which is good because they can now apply for these funds, but even if they aren't applying for the funds or receiving the funds, it's great for those communities to bring all those people together to work on this issue, and they've had some remarkable success in places like Dayton, Ohio, and Toledo, Ohio. They can look at their recidivism problem and tell you that they've saved millions of dollars. So it's something that is working. The kinds of programs that are supported would include skills training. So when someone gets out, to find what's available in the region in terms of needed skills and give these people the tools they need to get a job. It is dealing with mental health issues and encouraging people to get the medication they need and to help to get on their feet rather than go back to prison. It deals with drug treatment, so people that have had a substance abuse problem to ensure that they have the ability to get the treatment that they need. It's family-based, so the notion is to keep the families involved and engaged. And I think this is one reason it's been successful. When you look at the program, which we have monitored closely, you see that the recidivism rate tends to be lower when communities adopt these programs. So I believe it's working to save money for taxpayers, to reduce crime in our neighborhoods, and also to get people back to work, which is a good thing for all of us.
And these are programs that are implemented in the community once they're released or during their prison sentence?
These are primarily the reentry programs are for when someone gets out.
Okay.
There is also the ability to use some of this funding to start to work with people when they're still in prison. Mm-hmm. And we have a new reauthorization of the program that focuses even more on that and focuses on the issue of these reentry courts, where you have judges and prosecutors and probation officers and so on who are focused on this issue. So I think there's a real opportunity here to, again, not just reduce our prison population, but actually to get people back to work and rejoin families, reunite families, and reduce crime in our neighborhoods. So it's really pretty exciting. I was in Dayton, Ohio over the weekend talking to a judge who's been very involved in this effort. He's got a reentry court, and he is very appreciative of this help from the federal level, matching the help that he can get locally to be able to reduce recidivism.
You've also worked on legislation to reduce mandatory minimums and programs to reduce prison time for prisoners who complete prisoner reentry programs like the Second Chance Act. Is it fair to say that for many nonviolent offenders, the less time they spend in prison, probably the better off they're going to be?
Yeah, I do think that there is an opportunity in our prisons, and that legislation you're talking about is focused on the federal prisons. As you know, most people are in state prisons and local jails.
Right.
But at the federal level, Congress definitely has a direct interest in this. The Department of Justice spends 25% of its budget on the Bureau of Prisons, for instance. This is money that could otherwise be spent on things like federal investigators, prosecutors dealing with terrorism and other issues. So we have said that with regard to people who are in prison, if they're willing to partake in second chance type programs, particularly to get the job skills they need to be able to get a job when they get out, that they should be given credit and therefore having their time in prison reduced with the understanding that they're going to be able to get out of prison and, get a job and become productive citizens.
Are there any other changes that you'd like to see to better reform and rehabilitate Americans who get in trouble with the law?
Yeah, I mean, I think the general point is one that I made earlier, which is this is in all of our interests to deal with this issue. 95% of the people in prison who are behind bars are going to get out. And if you can give them some of the basic tools they need to get back on their feet rather than get back into a life of crime, it's good for everybody. It's certainly good for them and for their families. It's also good for the taxpayer in our communities. And I think, the federal legislation is important, and I support it strongly. I'm the author of it, of course. I think it's good, but it's really not about Washington. It's about what's going to happen at the local level. Get the whole community involved, get the employers involved. I'll go around the state and talk to employers a lot about asking for their help, to take a little chance and, hire somebody who's a returning prisoner and, who's been in the system. The experience that I've had in working with some of these employers, Ben, is very interesting. I mean, you hear, for the most part, these are loyal and faithful employees who are grateful for the opportunity. They understand that these employers are taking somewhat of a risk on them, and that leads to more loyalty, more dedication. And I was in Cleveland, Ohio, not long ago at a roundtable discussion with a gentleman named Melvin, who's been in and out of the system his whole life. A little younger than me. I'm 60 years old now, and as of this week, and so I'm talking to him about his life, and he had a daughter along the way who he'd never spent any time with, and he's been sober for now 4 or 5 years. He's got a job, and for the first time in his life, he actually has a home, and his daughter is living under his roof with him, and this guy's a productive citizen taking care of his family now. Let me leave you with one other story. Every Thursday, one Republican is asked to provide lunch. There are 54 Republicans in the Senate. This time I brought a guy up from Edwin's, which is a restaurant in Cleveland, Ohio, that hires exclusively people who come out of prison. They've had 89 graduates of their program. It's about a 6-month program. They teach people culinary skills. The owner came up along with one of his students to Washington, D.C., and got to serve the Republican senators and explain to them how this works. And so of those 89 graduates, all of them have found jobs. They've got about 30 restaurants in Cleveland that have hired these people, and 0 have returned to prison. It's an extraordinarily successful program, but it's an example of what can happen around the country if people engage and get involved and help give people that second chance and let them know, this is not a handout, it's a hand up for you to actually take control of your own life and, demonstrate personal responsibility and get your act together. And when given that opportunity, at least in the case of Edwin's and so many other examples I've seen around the state of Ohio, this can really work.
Well, that must be very gratifying for you to see your efforts paying off in that way. Is there anything that listeners can do to show their support for the reauthorization of the Second Chance Act?
Yeah, that would be great. I mean, we're trying to get it through the Judiciary Committee right now. It's called the Second Chance Reauthorization Act, and if they're willing to write their member of Congress or their senator, that would be terrific, just to talk about the fact that this one is one that actually makes sense. And then, I guess, even more importantly to me, just get engaged and involved. Find out about whether you got a reentry task force in your county or in your community. If you don't, maybe encourage others to join you and get one started. There are a lot of people who are prison tutors who are willing to go into prisons and help someone get a GED or help someone get some job skills that they need. Yeah. There's opportunities to do that. I think that's really rewarding too.
Great idea.
So I think just local involvement and getting involved is what makes sense.
Senator Rob Portman, I appreciate all your efforts on this issue, and thanks so much for coming on the show to talk about it.
You bet, Ben. Thanks a lot for having me on. Take care.
Folks, there's a big difference between being soft on crime and being smart on crime. As a matter of public safety, violent criminals should absolutely be taken off the streets and thrown in prison. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have to pay your debt to society when you commit a crime. But the whole point of having a criminal justice system is to punish and rehabilitate lawbreakers. Right now, America is doing a pretty good job of the former, but a terrible job of the latter. We ought to be able to punish and reform nonviolent offenders without permanently destroying their lives. You've probably heard the saying, idle hands are the devil's plaything. Well, it's hard to set a man back on the right track when you've ripped him away from his wife and children, taken away his ability to earn a living, and locked him away with nothing to do in a place where his entire peer group consists of even worse criminals. Our prison system should be held to the same accountability as any other costly, bloated, inefficient government program. We're spending billions of dollars a year on a system that by most measurements does not work. There has to be a smarter way, and the time for sensible, results-based criminal justice reform is now. Thanks again to Senator Rob Portman, Julie Stewart, and Jeff Smith for coming on the show. You can learn more about Families Against Mandatory Minimums at fam.org. That's FAMM.org. And follow Julie Stewart on Twitter at @JulieOnJustice. Also, I'll include an Amazon link in the show notes where you can order that book by Jeff Smith called Mr. Smith Goes to Prison. Or you can download the audio version of his book for free through that special promotion for our listeners at audibletrial.com/kickasspolitics. And finally, if you live in Ohio, Senator Rob Portman is up for re-election in 2016, and this is just one of many reasons to give him your vote and send him back to Washington. And you also might want to keep a lookout for him on the short list for the Republican nomination for Vice President come July. And help us reach our end-of-the-year fundraising goal by donating to our GoFundMe campaign at gofundme.com/kickasspolitics. It's really important that we fully fund our production expenses for the next year, so I can put my energies toward great new guests, interesting topics, and producing new episodes. So go to gofundme.com/kickasspolitics. Follow us on Twitter at @KAPolitics or visit Kickass Politics on Facebook. And as always, I welcome your comments and suggestions at comments@kickasspolitics.com. But for now, I'm Ben Mathis, and thanks for listening to Kickass Politics. This podcast may not be reproduced without express written permission. Kickass Politics is a trademark of Mathis Entertainment, Inc.